Welcome back to our next lecture in our Chapter 2 lecture series, and we are talking in this presentation about carbohydrates. This is the first of our 4 macromolecules, organic macromolecules that we'll be studying. Remember, the term organic means carbon and hydrogen-based molecules, and the term macro, that prefix means big. So we're looking at very large molecules here, much bigger than what we've looked at so far. Now, carbohydrates are the primary source of energy for your cell. When you think of this as the primary source, think about 60% of your cell's energy is coming from the carbohydrate. When we talk about the source of energy for the cell, it's primarily the carbohydrate molecule called glucose. This is what your cell wants to use. This is what's called the monomer of the carbohydrate. So remember, as we are looking at our macromolecules, these are big molecules. They're polymers, and they're made up of lots of building blocks connected together. The building block for your carbohydrate is a monosaccharide, which means single sugar, and the one that we'll talk about for the human body is glucose. So whenever you're eating a carbohydrate, ultimately it's going to be broken down into glucose by your body. And that then is the primary source of energy for the cell. That's the preferred source of energy for your body. Now, if you have extra glucose, your cells will turn that into a polymer called glycogen. So glycogen will be the way your liver cells and your skeletal muscle cells will actually store glucose. So if you have extra glucose, it's stored as glycogen. So both glucose and glycogen are examples of carbohydrates. The basic structure for a carbohydrate is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms in a ratio of 1 carbon atom to 2 hydrogen atoms to 1 oxygen atom. And very often our carbohydrates are going to be in a ring structure. So you can see we have 2 diagrams here. One is the linear sequence for your carbohydrate. What's nice about this is you can see that ratio very easily, the 1 carbon, 2 hydrogen, and 1 oxygen ratio. And then when you stick it in the ring structure, you see the actual structure that you should start associating with carbohydrates. Now, both of these are representing here glucose. So glucose, remember, is a monomer or building block for carbohydrates. It's just one of a few examples of monomers for carbohydrates. The monomer is going to be a single sugar or a monosaccharide. So here we have the ending saccharide, which refers to sugar. Now, glucose is, of course, the preferred form. This is the monomer in our bodies. Plants have the monomer fructose, which is fruit sugar. And so we will see, if you're eating fruit, you're going to break that fructose down and convert it into a glucose molecule. Disaccharides are 2 sugars linked together, and probably the most familiar example of a disaccharide is sucrose. This is your table sugar. And then your term polysaccharide is talking about your polymer. Remember, poly means many, so this translates to many sugars. And the example that we'll talk about in the human body is glycogen, as we've already mentioned. Now, I've not listed every possible carbohydrate that exists on the planet here. I've given you a couple examples of monomers, 1 example of a disaccharide, and 1 example of a polysaccharide. These are ones that we'll talk about most often in this class, and when it comes to the human body, we're really just going to talk about glucose and glycogen as the molecules that are being used by the body or made by the body. Notice that whenever you're talking about a sugar, you very often will have an ending OSE. Not every single sugar is going to have an OSE ending. Obviously, glycogen does not. But if you have an OSE ending, you should assume that you're talking about a carbohydrate. And usually The OSE ending is applied to monosaccharides and disaccharides, although there are some polysaccharides that have an OSE ending, such as cellulose, which is going to be found in the cell wall of plants. Now, when we are talking about how the body uses carbohydrates, we will see that we have the ability to take a monomer and turn that into a disaccharide. Our body's not really going to be making sucrose, but plant cells might. Notice here that in order to make sucrose, you're going to take a glucose plus a fructose. This is an example of a dehydration synthesis. Remember, dehydration synthesis means you're dehydrating, you're pulling out a water molecule, and you're making something new, which is our term synthesis. Notice then you have your disaccharide, which is sucrose. Now this reaction happens in our bodies in the reverse. So when we're eating sucrose, we're going to hydrolyze it to a glucose and a fructose. That glucose is ready then for the body to use to make energy. The fructose has to then be converted into glucose, and then it is ready for the body to use it to make energy. So remember, when we talk about carbohydrates, carbohydrates are not the energy molecule, rather the source for that energy molecule, which we'll be discussing a little bit later. We talked about glycogen as the polysaccharide that will store glucose in the body. And when we talk about it as a polysaccharide, it's a big molecule. Notice how many glucose molecules are attached together. Each one of those circles in that lower part of the diagram is representing a single glucose. And then they've zoomed in on it so you can see those glucose structures. Remember, glucose is the source of energy. Glycogen is the storage of that glucose. This glycogen molecule will be made in the liver cells as well as skeletal muscle cells.